enough to ban her to Siberia, which was a very difficult life. I don't know if you've read what happened in post-war Europe, but it was a punishment. It was like a huge prison camp. So we illegally escaped Lithuania because, well, actually Lithuania we were legal. My mother was born in Königsberg, but she had lived, which is Germany, East Prussia. We then went to, she lived in Danzig, which you might have heard about because that's what caused the Polish Revolution when the Poles got their independence. So we had an address in Danzig, so we could go to Poland legally from Lithuania. And since then, we went illegally with false passports from Lithuania to the Czechoslovakia, to Hungary, where we landed in prison, and then to Austria, which was where we wanted to go because Austria was divided in those times into 4 sections. Because the English Americans said everybody owned a piece of Austria. And we could go into Italy, the Italian section, and then take a ship to Israel, which was our final destination. My grandparents had already left for Israel in 1935 when I was born. They waited for me to be born, and the next day they left for Israel. So we had a family, which was unusual, because most of the people who stayed in Europe did not survive. And that's what we wanted. I mean, there was nobody left in Europe for us. But as it turns out, immigration was stopped, and we lived in Italy for 6 years, and I loved Italy. It was the first stable place I'd been. I started at the age of 10. I started school in a Jewish school because what happened, there were other refugees from different countries that were in the same position as I. And first grade was made up of all ages. And nobody spoke Italian, and everything was taught in Italian. So I was among peers. I mean, if you can imagine yourself either as a 6-year-old going through what I did, or as a 10-year-old starting over again. I don't know if you can remember that far back. Some of you are older now. But it's a time where everything is very impressionable. So I did get some education in Italy. I studied at the Opera House at La Scala. Also, I was admitted as the first foreigner in the School of Ballet. And then I did 3 years in one, in a language I didn't know. And then we came to America suddenly. What happened was the Korean War broke out. And my father, in his wisdom actually, said, if a war breaks out on the soil of America, that will be the last war ever fought. It's going to be the end of the world. So that's how I became an American. And again, I came here with about 3 years of schooling, and I was put into 9th grade without knowing the language. It was a struggle, but I ended up graduating, going to Barnard, going to starting graduate school, and blessing America, because it gives me such a place of stability and freedom of choice, which I'd never known, because everything else was so prescribed in my life just to survive. In Italy, for instance, when we first arrived, we had nothing. We slept on stone floors in the Jewish Community Center. We had food whenever they had food. My parents finally sent me to what is called a hakshara, which is a children's holding camp, where other children in my position were put together. I was in another camp also for children that had food, which was what sustained me. So coming to America, but my father, even in Italy, he was able to establish himself. By the time we left, we had a chauffeur in a car again. So he was good at making money, but And you had to reestablish this contact, pre-war contacts in South Africa and in England, so he was able to do that. But then we left everything behind again when the Korean War broke out, we came here. But he continued, and I did finish my studies, and I have 2 sons and 4 grandchildren who continued the legacy. Proves Hitler wrong, that the Jews are still here. They will be, because God made a covenant with Abraham, and the covenant is that anyone who goes against the Jews will not prevail. And so far, I'm here to prove that. My grandchildren are too. So I wanted to ask you to remember the Holocaust, remember the experiences, remember the cruelty as well as the enormous heroism of the rescuers who risked their lives to save another life. My rescuers, for instance, one of them saved not only Jews like myself, but she saved a deaf mute who would have been killed by the Nazis. She saved a widow with children who was useless to the Nazis because they couldn't contribute and would have been in danger. And she saved the Russians who would have been killed by the Nazis. So many lives were imperiled. But I mean, the Holocaust was not only making Jews the victims, but all the Jews were targeted as victims. So have to put that in focus, that it has, other genocides were there, but this one has a uniqueness about it that can be used as a symbol, as a lesson, as a beacon for better times. And I hope when you leave this hall, you go back to your families, your friends, you'll take this message and convey it to them, and most of all, hold it in your heart. So what I'd like to do is open this to questions and to see if we can continue, because I'm sure I left things out. Yes, please. Okay. You have to speak a little louder, maybe? Oh, it was called a ghetto. Ghettos were usually holding camps. The question was, what was the name of the concentration camp you were in? And it was called a ghetto as opposed to concentration camps. There were different functions of different concentration camps. They became very specialized in some ways, and the refining of mass killing was horrendous. My ghetto was one of the first, because Lithuania was one of the first to be occupied. And so they didn't have that distinction. So mine was both a holding camp and a killing camp. So they did everything on the premises. It was called the Kovno ghetto. Kovno is the Jewish name for Kaunas, which was the capital of Lithuania. It could also be called the Kaunas ghetto. In the killing place, it was called the 9th fort. They had seven forts, and then 9 forts, and then they each had their own killing machines and torture places. The 9th fort is now, where the ghetto one, has now become a museum, and the Lithuanians have sort of made it as if there were no Jews there, but the Russians were the ones who were martyred. It was very interesting how history can be rewritten. So you have that one ghetto, Kovno ghetto in Kaunas, Lithuania, which represents both the ghettos and the killing fields, and a museum at this point that is being diluted, shall we put. Yeah, thank you for the question.